Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. How will the United States pharmaceutical industry be reshaped under the new Trump administration? As the US represents 45% of global pharma sales, it's critical for the entire industry. And that's the big question we're going to attempt to answer on the podcast today with Gil Roth, President of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association. In this interview, we speak about what tariffs might mean to global trade, expected changes at the FDA, potential deregulation of mergers and acquisitions, and what all this might mean to contract manufacturing. It's important to say that this is a fast-moving situation, meaning that what's said today will likely be out of date tomorrow. So we started off by talking about the sheer volume of announcements coming out of Washington at the moment.
To some extent, the challenges aren't day to day. It can be minute to minute. I mean, I sent an update to our PBOA priority list about the tariff situations with Mexico, Canada, and China a couple of mornings ago. And 15 minutes after hitting send, the Mexico tariffs were pushed off for 30 days. That afternoon, we had our big monthly legislative update call with our advocacy firm in Washington. We talked through the Canada and China aspects of this. And about 3 hours after that, the Canadian tariffs were also moved down the line 30 days. So things can be very fluid right now, especially as the new administration is settling in. There's a lot of things going on that we're still trying to sort of discern the policy and philosophy behind a lot of it as it relates in our world specifically to pharma manufacturing and making sure that patients get access to the drugs that our members make on behalf of their customers.
There's so many implications, all this, and so many different threads to try to unravel. At the start of 2025, what would you say the general sentiment is amongst PBOA members, those that you speak to in manufacturing?
Well, I think there's optimism guardedly about the R&D funding is largely, seen as the lifeblood for this sector. So lowering of interest rates means higher propensity for R&D investment from venture capital and the like. And that can lead to, more work in terms of early pipeline products reaching our members and being able to help our customers develop and eventually manufacture these treatments for patients down the line. As funding has started to come back in the past year or so, it's largely been funneled towards late stage R&D projects, things that are closer to a commercial return, which is fine. But we all know that if you're not taking care of those earlier stages of R&D, you're not going to have those later stages down the line. So we're hoping to see more early stage R&D investment, more freedom when it comes to funding all around. Tangential to that, the belief is that this current administration will be friendlier towards merger and acquisition activity. My members don't talk to me along those terms. Understandably, they're not out there telling me, "Hey, Gil, we're about to sell company X." But, there's the fact that the CDMO sector is largely private equity funded, which means there's always an impetus to turn the company to either sell or flip or somehow move the company in 3 to 5 years generally. So the belief is that there'll be more freedom for merger and acquisition activity. Still, there's a propensity for certain acquisitions to be blocked. Historically, this current administration, when they were in power from 2017 to 21, certain mergers were slower than others, based potentially on some personal issues. So we'll see how this administration deals with M&A activity going forward and whether some of its policies will lead to lowering of interest rates in terms of the overall economy and thus strengthening R&D.
Yep. I guess that's all sort of hanging in the balance a lot when it comes to this sort of new era of trade wars and trade tariffs, which are starting and stopping. China's definitely covered. Mexico and Canada, there's a bit of a reprieve at the moment. And more than likely, certainly the noises seem to be that the European Union is next in line with this. I suppose the purpose of all of this, presumably, is about strengthening US manufacturing. Is that how you're reading the motivation for this?
That's been the stated purpose, and we had to take some of these things on face value. So the assumption is, and it's something that came up in the previous two administrations, trying to strengthen the domestic manufacturing infrastructure, whether it's for overall business or for particular crisis situations, as we saw during Operation Warp Speed and beyond. But yes, that's been what we've read. The initial stated purpose and trigger for the tariffs with Canada, Mexico, and China have actually been the fentanyl and immigration threat in the U.S. Those are the flashpoints that were used to initiate the emergency economic powers that the president chose to use for announcing these tariffs. I don't know from an EU perspective whether that lever will be used or another one. But yes, there's been the assumption that this is, to help manufacture, to add more manufacturing in the US or to bring manufacturing back to the US for certain types of products.
There was a talk that Thermo Fisher's CEO did at JP Morgan where he was saying that America First policies would actually be pretty positive for those domestic manufacturers.
I think he was speaking from the article that I remember reading, that for Thermo Fisher in particular, having, and this is the key area that I think we're talking about, API manufacturing in the U.S. Thermo has made some investments, they've acquired facilities, and they have those sorts of operations in America, and thus would be in a position to potentially benefit if there is a movement to onshore API manufacturing in particular. From what we know from the way the market is currently working, a lot of the Chinese pharmaceutical activity that would be covered by this is API manufacturing, APIs being sourced, and a lot of those tend to be for the generic industry, which are lower dollar value and thus could be disrupted more by a significant percentage increase through tariffs, which could lead to companies trying to find sources in non-tariff regions or ones with lesser tariff structures around them.
Yeah, we did a admittedly fairly unscientific poll yesterday, and we were asking the question, how would non-US pharma manufacturers adapt to this new era of trade barriers? The top response with 50% was that it's going to force non-US companies to diversify globally, focusing on other markets other than the US. But then 35% was saying that people have to find new ways to be part of US companies, whether that's with joint ventures or partnerships. And the remainder, about 15%, was saying that, to your point, maybe there's something around splitting of API and final products could potentially be a way around some of this. So if the final finished dosage manufacturing happens in the US. Do you think that would help?
I'm not sure. As far as that latter one goes, I'm really not sure what the local or the content regulations around this would be. The Association for Accessible Medicines, a generic industry association in the U.S., has really come out against the 10% tariff over Chinese products, even though a good amount of those APIs end up getting sent to or exported to India, where they're then converted into final dosage form and then shipped to the U.S. From what I gather, that would not make them solely Indian products. There would still be that China tariff being added to them, which would really damage the economics of a lot of the more commoditized generic products in the U.S. They, in their public statements, have said that this could potentially lead to drug shortages, given the lack of flexibility that generic drug owners have when it comes to the contracts they have with group purchasing organizations in the U.S. So, yeah, diversifying. I could see trying to partner or find domestic U.S. manufacturing operations be important for some of these products. But yeah, I think a lot of it is going to revolve around some of the economics of certain classes of drugs in the U.S. for sure.
Interesting times for sure. With the FDA, there's so much change which seems to be happening there. It seems to be a revolving door at the moment of people leaving, and RFK Jr. is getting a step closer now. I think he's been approved by the Senate.
They'll probably have the vote next week. He came out of committee yesterday, and from what we're hearing, probably middle of next week will be the potential confirmation vote.
You're well connected within Washington. What are you hearing that you can talk about?
I'll say one of the things we've learned now, I've been running, I launched PBOA in 2014 as a venue for the CDMO sector to work with FDA as well as with Congress and presidential administrations. When I started, I thought it was just FDA facing. This is what we're going to do. And then I discovered you have to have a lot more reach, especially in Washington, to do this effectively. The big thing we learned, and it started when we were negotiating the second iteration of the generic drug user fees, or GDUFA 2, back in 2015, 2016, we had ideas for things to improve how FDA works, how they review drugs, inspect facilities, et cetera, really kind of trying to revamp some of the ways they work with industry. And one of the things we were told was it's a really big ship and it takes a lot of time to steer and move. And I think that holds up. And you can extrapolate that to the rest of the federal government and all these agencies that are currently facing some issues. With FDA in particular, the regulations and the activities they undergo are ultimately about patient safety and access. And we see the same thing, although this isn't our area at all, with the food inspection, where we had the infant formula issues a few years ago, where there were problems in that one site that led to a significant shortage of supply. And again, there were economic drivers behind all this. From what I recall, one of the key issues was that a letter that was sent to FDA explaining what some of these problems were showed up when a lot of people weren't in the office because of COVID, and the letter sat for a while, and there was, less, they would have had more time to go in and try to help remediate things before a crisis occurred. The agency's work is critical, and the idea that it can all be disrupted or somehow done, much cheaper does not necessarily hold up.
Which seems to be the mood music, of course, coming from Doge and Elon Musk. Seems to all be about, efficiency.
That AI will save the day and make everybody redundant.
Yeah.
I'll hold back from editorializing about that. I'll just say that the people there work hard, and this is not easy. We'll see, both with the return to office orders, as well as other aspects of the employment contracts and how some of the staff at FDA were hired under the 21st Century Cures Act, what flexibility the agency retains for being able to hold on to its personnel. I'll say that we're going into the fourth iteration of GDUFA. We'll be negotiating that this year. As the other user fees also get negotiated, prescription drug, medical devices, and biosimilars. Those are critical. They account for, along with a few other user fees, they account for almost or more than half of FDA's total budget. And they are built around commitments that FDA makes toward industry and the number of full-time equivalents or staff they'll need to be able to implement those and actually live up to their commitments. Messing with the government's ability to hire would mess with FDA's ability to fulfill its user fee requirements. And those things are negotiated between FDA and industry, but then transmitted to Congress. They become part of a statute and law. So the Congress calls in FDA to account for how it performed under these user fees every year. So there are other parties that the agency is accountable to. They're getting a large amount of their funding from industry. That's important for them to be able to function and to be able to review both new drug applications and generics, as well as other types of operations they perform. So we're interested in seeing how FDA and HHS and the White House are going to approach the user fee negotiations this year. We know PDUFA has a lot to work on. We're not involved in that user fee directly, where the generic drug one we will be at the table for. So that's a mechanism for seeing what FDA's priorities are going forward. We know the things they can and can't be involved in. I always say in any congressional staff meeting I go into where I explain the CDMO sector, I always start off with our members are not involved in drug pricing issues. Please don't call us into a
Yeah.
hearing about drug pricing. Similarly, FDA doesn't have a direct lever when it comes to drug pricing. They can do certain things when it comes to drug shortages, but they can't directly impact the economics of the drug space. So seeing
Mhm.
how some of the administration's priorities around that intersect with what FDA's actual powers are. Um, it's something we're all very interested in and making sure that we can be part of to, again, make drugs, let's see, safe, effective, and accessible to US patients.
On the regulatory side, what would you say is next for Biosecure? It's sort of obviously got to a certain point, hasn't become law yet.
Nope.
Even then, the shockwave seemed to have been spread across the market anyway, and people seem to have moved in anticipation of it. Where would you say we're at with that?
I'll say right now, I've heard absolutely nothing ever since the failure of Biosecure to be included in the National Defense Authorization Act or the continuing resolution at the end of the year. A few days ago, the House Select Committee for China, which was the again non-statutory committee that helped launch Biosecure, they did announce who their members are. So I will
Hmm.
look back over that and see if there are people we've worked with, and try to get some idea of whether they see it resurfacing or not. But I think a great deal of it will hinge on what the president's approach to China is. Um, I
Hmm.
think, we don't know, frankly. There is this 10% tariff that's been instituted. There have been targeted tariff retaliation. Um, we don't know. If they find some grand agreement between them, then perhaps Biosecure just goes away.
Hmm.
I think it was a significant operation for both the client side and CDMOs to assess what the market would look like if the 5 companies that were named in the initial iteration of Biosecure, were prohibited from working with companies that received US government contracts. Um, I don't know how many of those client side companies really pulled the trigger, really
Hmm.
went forward with shifting away from any of those 5 named companies. And we've seen some activity from those companies in terms of divesting some of their Western operations. I don't think that's Biosecure related. It seems a lot of for the cell and gene therapy divestments that were made by one of the Wuxi companies, I
Hmm.
will say that a lot of firms have made divestments of their cell and gene therapy operations on a
Hmm.
CDMO side. But yeah, I have no idea where it goes going forward. We try and stay on top of things. I'll be down on the Hill next week and we'll poke around talking to congressional staff just to get some idea of their agenda and what priorities look like. But I'll say it was a wake up call, certainly.
Hmm.
It did cause a lot of clients to start figuring out what their alternatives are, what the timelines look like. Um, the fact that it overlapped with the announcement of the Novo Holdings acquisition of Catalent and the Novo Nordisk sub acquisition from there, it created an atmosphere where a lot of companies were looking, just trying to understand what the rest of the landscape looks like, where things can move, whether it's the sort of chemistry operations and discovery work and other early
Hmm.
development that they were getting from a Wuxi AppTech, or some of the sterile fill finish services that were provided by some of those Catalent facilities that would get incorporated into Novo Nordisk under that deal.
Hmm. All of this, with Wuxi divesting their US operations, for example, for US based CDMOs, it does all add up to it being quite a positive year ahead potentially.
I mean, it depends on which ones overlap with those services, for
Hmm.
sure. There are a lot of different things that Wuxi had a lot of different sorts of businesses, some of which were, again, US operating. But yeah, it's a big question mark as to where companies go, which markets they see as most beneficial to be in. Whether, again, you can rebuild, particularly from what we're seeing with some of the tariff ideas, where you can build an API infrastructure,
Hmm.
as well as other chemical infrastructure going forward. Um, and we've talked about this with Congress pretty much since I've been around in PBOA. That's a major issue is understanding not just, where everything is, but why things moved to where they did and what it would take to rebuild or to find other markets for them.
What would you say the state is of capacity at the moment in the US amongst manufacturers? After COVID, there was a lot of work in, and which took some time to come online around manufacturing facilities. How much capacity is there currently?
It varies. It's going to depend on the types of dosage forms,
Hmm.
commercial versus clinical, et cetera. When the when the Federal Trade Commission called me about that aforementioned acquisition deal, um, I really looked over our members and non-members for announcements about sterile fill finish capacity, either coming online or projected to come online. And I contended to the FTC that there would be enough capacity to offset, the Novo Catalent deal being finalized and potentially those three facilities becoming captive capacity for Novo Nordisk.
Hmm.
That it just wasn't evenly distributed. There weren't three facilities that would offset those three facilities, but there would be enough out there to accommodate this. And I stand by that. I believe that the investments that have been made in the industry, both from startups and expansions from existing providers, will keep the sterile fill finish space going well, even with GLP-1s continuing to sort of blow through the roof.
What about sustainability, Gil? Are you hearing much on that? Obviously, that's been such a priority over recent years around scope 3 emissions, adoption of green chemistry, waste reduction targets, etc. It certainly feels as though the new administration is going to be moving things in a very different direction.
I think that'll be a conflict for US and Europe, frankly. Europe is much stronger on this. They don't seem to be relenting on a lot of the, we'll say ESG related issues, but particularly with sustainability, as part of the environmental aspect, they take it seriously. And it's a question of how it gets implemented and the animosity towards that by the current administration, as well as a lot of, we'll say the sort of business environment around that will create a tension for sure. But the world is not just the US and Europe. There are going to be other companies or other regions at play here deciding what really matters to them when it comes to how do we build these industries? How do we get drugs to patients? Whether these factors are important too. So
Yeah.
I'm interested in seeing how it works out. I don't have kids, so the sustainability thing, it means something different to, say, my brother who has three children who are looking at a future ahead of them, and we want to make sure that there is a world that's relatively breathable air and
Yeah.
drinkable water.
All the big pharma companies have signed up to net zero targets. So you'd think they would still continue down that road anyway, irrespective perhaps of what the legislative advice is.
You would hope. I certainly, fingers crossed, that holds up. In the US, there are court cases around hiring and quote unquote affirmative action that have led to potential lawsuits against companies based on their hiring practices.
Mm.
I could see an extrapolation of that or a parallel version of that leads to, environmental considerations, somehow being against shareholder interests or something
Yep.
ridiculous like that. That's me editorializing. I apologize.
The same thing with health and safety as well, and
Yeah, yeah,
DE&I, as you mentioned.
yeah. So we'll see if that becomes a legal or lawsuit flashpoint as opposed to, a shareholder boycott sort of angle that it currently has. But yeah, it's something where, again, you see a lot of companies, as we saw with Biosecure as an example, when companies have to engage in major evaluations of how they operate, who they work with, et cetera, telling them a week later, that doesn't matter, go
Mm.
drill baby drill, or whatever the analog is. They're not necessarily going to do that. They're going to look at what they learned from those assessments and maybe try and find some middle way forward where they're still doing business and are doing things on a more sustainable basis.
In May, you'll be joining us at CDMO Live in Rotterdam, I'm very pleased to say. As part of that, you're going to be giving a bit of an update on everything that's happening
Yeah.
stateside with the CDMO space. What do you think you'll be talking about?
I think that the biggest thing will simply be whether, over 3 months we'll have more clarity in
Mm.
terms of where this administration is, in terms of how FDA is functioning and what Congress's priorities are. I hope to have more of an answer about the potentials for a biosecure, whether it's, dead and gone or, could exist in another iteration. I will say that one of the reasons it was pulled or did not advance on the Senate side at the end of last year really centered around the naming of 5 companies in particular. There was some disagreement as to whether the bill should be passed without naming anyone and simply having criteria for companies to be added. The idea behind that is that if a company is named in statute, it has to be named in another statute to be removed. Whereas if you just create criteria and it becomes added through an agency process, there's an off-ramp to remove them from the same list. So the idea was perhaps you remove those 5 companies with the idea that they would be the first companies to be investigated or studied under a revised biosecure. That didn't have time to advance or get traction. But that was the argument that was made late in the game, that perhaps things need to, not have 5 named companies so much as a whole bunch of criteria that would disqualify a CDMO or a provider in China from working with these companies. So hoping for more clarity, greater idea where things are going geopolitically, keeping my fingers crossed that we will have a degree of things slowing down a bit and a greater idea of where things are. But right now, yes, things are moving very fast, and it's very difficult to really slow it down enough to give. I've told my members when I send them these updates about the tariff situations in particular, I'd like to keep them up to speed. At the same time, I don't want to overwhelm them with emails and don't want so many things coming in that they can't keep track of. What was the last thing we heard from Gil? So I try to hit them at key points when things seem to have been solidified a bit and fail. But I do my best with that stuff. So we're looking to see more clarity, what the investment landscape looks like, what we start to hear out of spring trade show season, going through DCAT and a few other events and seeing and getting to meet with companies and get an idea of where they are and where their customers are coming from, I think is going to be really important when it comes to speaking at your event, which I'm honored to be invited to in May in Rotterdam.
No shortage of things to talk about, that's for sure. Gil, a pleasure as ever speaking to you, and really looking forward to you joining us at CDMO Live in May.
As am I. I'm just hoping they let me back in the country afterwards. I'm just kidding. But thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Experience the future of contract manufacturing at CDMO Live 2025. Join us at the World Trade Centre Rotterdam on May the 7th and 8th, 2025 for an exclusive event that brings together the sharpest minds in biopharma outsourcing. For 2 days filled with market insights, best practices and partnering. Early bird tickets are now available, so head to cdmolive.com to download the agenda and to book your ticket.